Hello and welcome to 1 Hour SaaS. I am Mubashir Iqbal. Everybody calls me Mubs. This is update for hour number 10. Today I kind of started thinking about the data model for for podcast paying. Haven't got it all finished out yet, but I started with podcasts and checks and check types because I started thinking about what's the information that we need to be able to do the thing that podcasting is meant to do. So we need to let users add a podcast, and that podcast will have different attributes. So we'll need to know the URL for the RSS feed, the URL for the website, sort of those kind of things. And some of those we might get automatically via some iTunes API, or some of those things we'll have to manually collect from the user, or we can let them enter them all manually as well. And then once we have that information and they've got active subscription and they activate the checks for that podcast, what are the checks that we want to actually do on the podcast? So there's a list of those, and we need to store information about those in the database. Maybe the user doesn't want to check all of those things. Maybe the podcast doesn't have a website, for example. So there's no point doing the website checks for that particular podcast. Or maybe they don't want to check the actual MP3 files for whatever reason. Just want to give the user the option to turn that kind of stuff on and off. And then so we have the podcast, we have the checks that we might want to run, so we have the table for that. And then I wrote a seeder which kind of loads in the list of checks that we want to run. Just kind of starting to plan ahead for trying to automate the script that will ultimately run run through the podcast, run through the different checks that we do, and kind of start to store that information. Not really much to show in this particular update. It's going to be a short update, but I will just hop over here to my desktop and just kind of walk you through some of the stuff that I did. So you can kind of see we got different migration tables here. So we created a podcast. Podcast has a name, a description, has some iTunes IDs and Spotify IDs, and podcasting. I made these all strings because not all of these have I don't know the format of these in each one of these. I know in iTunes most of these might be IDs, but they're not on Spotify and Google. And so we have the RSS feed URL, the website URL for the cover. I want to actually show like the image of the podcast cover in the interface somewhere, so we're going to store that somewhere as well. And then these are the different kinds of checks that we might want to enable. So this just checks if we can actually read the RSS feed. This checks if the RSS feed is actually valid. The same for the website. Can we connect to the website? Is it going to load? And then is the SSL for the website valid as well? It's important for SEO these days. And even browsers will throw errors and things like that if the SSL certificate isn't valid. Then we're going to check if we can actually read the MP3 files. We probably won't download them all, but we'll do a quick little head check, make sure that each one of the MP3 files is actually valid and has a specific, has a size over 0. And then this was a kind of a new check that I kind of came up on the fly because I figured it might be important to know if your podcast is still listed in sort of iTunes. So let's say iTunes decide they want to unpublish your podcast because some profanity or somebody reported it or whatever. If we have your iTunes API, we can actually ping the iTunes API, do a search for that particular, or your title or your specific ID, and see if that still exists. And so it'd be a quick little way to actually make sure you haven't been unpublished from any of those big directories, which obviously have a big impact on if your podcast is available or not. Because if it's not in iTunes anymore, you're going to be in trouble. And then just some fields to enable the actual monitoring of the actual of the podcast. And then because we're going to have restrictions of how many podcasts people can have, a way to archive podcasts if you don't want to monitor that one anymore. And okay, so just carrying on. I just paused the recording for a second. And then, so these are the different check types. So there's a name, a slug, description, various fields, and then there's the actual checks. So when you actually run one of those checks, we store the fact that this is wrong. This should not be team. This should be podcast. That's a good thing. I'm doing this video again because I didn't pick that up when I was doing some copying and pasting. So this references the podcast that you're running the check for, the actual check type that you're running, where the check actually ran from. So at some point down the road, we're going to check from multiple places around the world. So just kind of setting that up now, whether this check passed or if it failed, how long it took to run. And in some cases, we're going to want to know what the response time was. So if we're pinging the RSS feed or pinging the website, we want to know how long it took to respond, because that's helpful information to put in a chart. And then there's going to be lots of other information that's associated with these checks. So with the MP3 files, for example, how big was the file? Or, how big did the web service, did the file server say the file was? That kind of stuff. Even with the SSL cert, there might be information about the SSL cert that you want to store so that you can report that back to the user, or you can compare checks to see, last time it said that this was the name on the SSL cert, this time it said this is the name on the SSL cert, and if it changed, we probably want to alert the user on that too. And so that's all of that stuff. That's kind of the three models that I kind of thought about in this last hour, is spend some time thinking through how the system would work in terms of doing the checks and things like that. And then I did write just a quick seeder. So these are the different check types that we're going to have, and so I just wanted to write, so I don't have to manually enter these every time. Just write a quick seeder which allows us to enter that. And now that I dropped now I messed up that DB table, I'm going to roll back the migration, and then we're going to run the migration again to fix that, and then I can just run the seed again. So now we've seeded those. That's the only seed that we have right now. So you can see here we've got the check types. The checks is obviously blank, and the podcast table is blank too, but it should have all the structures and foreign keys and things like that. But yeah, I think that that's it for today. Just with this kind of thing, you have to think more than you actually write. Think about how you're going to use the information. Think about the kind of information you need to do the things that you want to do, and then you build out the migrations and seeds based off of that. And that was basically what I did. I think tomorrow is going to be just thinking about, once we do these checks, how do we want to report that information to the user that we ran these checks, but also if there's an error, how do we alert the user to the check? So how does the user configure that, and then how do we do that without spamming the user with like 1,000 your website's down kind of alerts and things like that. So that'll be tomorrow, and so we'll keep this one short. Okay, see you next time.